everybody. We got a great one today, for a change. We have Tim Mak, who's been reporting from Ukraine for the last 3 years. He arrived in Kyiv the day the war started in 2022 on one of the last flights into the country. And Tim has been reporting on the war through his Substack, the Counteroffensive with Tim Mak. Now, we recorded this on Wednesday night, so before the depressing exchange in the Oval Office. And to be frank, I'm depressed. Last week in the monologue, I talked about how this was all about that first phone call between Trump and Zelensky, where Zelensky wouldn't go along with Trump and say Ukraine was investigating corruption by Joe Biden and Hunter Biden. This was revenge for that phone call. Revenge served cold. And when I talked to Tim on Wednesday, he kind of called it. Here's Tim on how Trump treats allies.
The way that Trump has been, if you want to even call it negotiating, is that he's been using historical bonds of affection and alliances and friendships as if they were currency, as if they were leverage, right? That's not how you treat friends and partners and neighbors. But all around the world, Trump has been taking these relationships, which have been built many times on shared sacrifices and even blood during wars, and exploiting these relationships for extracting either personal or national resources and concessions, only to turn around after there have been some concessions to demand more. It's an evil way to think about friendship and partnerships, I think.
And of course, in the Oval Office, Trump references that whole thing.
Let me tell you, Putin went through a hell of a lot with me. He went through a phony witch hunt where they used him and Russia. You ever hear of that deal? That was a phony Hunter Biden, Joe Biden scam. Hillary Clinton, Shifty Adam Schiff. It was a Democrat scam. And he had to go through that. And he did go through it. We didn't end up in a war. And he went through it. He was accused of all that stuff. He had nothing to do with it. It came out of Hunter Biden's bathroom. It came out of Hunter Biden's bedroom. It was disgusting.
So Zelensky has finally been properly punished for not doing Trump's bidding way back. 400,000 Ukrainians have been killed in this war, over 700,000 Russians, 20,000 Ukrainian children kidnapped and taken to Russia. No one wants this to stop more than Zelensky, more than Ukraine. But it has to be on terms that doesn't just set up another Russian invasion down the road, like the one that Trump called genius 3 years ago. Most of all, this is in the United States' interest. Our interests ally with the rest of Europe's and not with Russia and Vladimir Putin. Somebody in this administration has to understand that. Maybe Marco Rubio. I hope today was just a bizarre bump in the road. Well, let's get to my conversation with Tim Mak. I think you'll get a lot out of it because we got a great one today. For a change. Tim Mak, you are in Taipei. Most days would find you in Kyiv, right?
That's right. So I cover the war based out of Ukraine and have been there for more than 3 years now.
More than 3 years. So from the beginning of the war?
In fact, from the night the war started, I landed on one of the last commercial flights into Kyiv right before the full-scale invasion began. It was a bit of a wild experience.
Wow. So at that time, the U.S. had told Ukraine that the Russians were going to invade.
Right.
That was Biden's doing, telling them what was going to happen, and they were prepared for it.
Well, you could say that they were warned about it. I wouldn't say that they were prepared for it. I think that many Ukrainians, till the very last moment, hoped and thought it wouldn't happen, that this was all just a big charade by Russia and that war wouldn't come. Zelensky was one of them, by the way. Zelensky was famously said that people in Ukraine would be barbecuing in the summer. Unfortunately, that wasn't to be.
But they did have some preparations. I mean, they didn't get caught completely off guard, right? Because the Russians had planned to land near Kyiv and take it over very quickly.
Right. Well, the forces near Kyiv were not prepared for that. And that's why Russian forces were able to progress so quickly in those first few days. It was
Oh,
only after a really very resilient counterattack in the first few weeks of the war that Ukraine was able to kick out the Russian invaders. But initially, they were really expecting, if anything, some battles to the east of Ukraine. They never thought it would be a full-scale war with an attempt to decapitate the government and remove Zelensky from power directly and surround the capital city. I mean, that wasn't really something that most Ukrainians, the vast majority of Ukrainians, really sought to countenance.
but even this, weren't we warning them? Wasn't Biden saying this is what we're getting, what we're hearing, and get ready for this?
In the context of the time, the United States actually warned that it would happen around mid-February, around the 16th or so. And so by the 23rd, 24th, when it actually happened, there was a lot of, talk about, oh, well, the American warnings were all just hype. And there was a lot of hopeless optimism by the Ukrainians that this would never happen. If you remember, there were a ton of friendly ties, familial ties, economic ties between these two countries, and they just didn't think that it would ever go down that way.
Well, that hopeless optimism is not there right now as we talk. In a couple of days, Zelensky is going to be in Washington, right?
Well, that's right. It's part of, basically, there's no other way to put it, but this extortionate attempt by Donald Trump to extract from Ukraine its resources at a time when their people are dying.
How is that deal being worked out? Do we know how that has worked out, or are we going to discover that on Friday, or is that going to eke out?
Well, here's the thing. We don't know the contours of the deal. It may not even be appropriate to call it a deal as much as it is a deal to talk about more deals. I think the Ukrainian position was to react with shock and dismay over the first offer by the Trump administration, which was essentially, hey, you owe us $500 billion.
And it's not anywhere near $500 billion anyway, right?
Well, the current deal doesn't specifically lay out a figure like that.
But I've heard that figure, 500 billion, and how much have we spent in fighting this war? The United States.
About 100 billion and change in military aid and economic and humanitarian aid. So it's not as if the Ukrainians owe that much. It's also worth pointing out that the Europeans have contributed more than the Americans, and they're not expecting any sort of monetary compensation for it. They understand that it's in the shared defense of Europe to back Ukraine.
Which I thought we thought.
Well, here's the thing. From the Ukrainian perspective, they were given a gift, a grant, if you will, and suddenly they're being called up and it's the bank and they're saying, well, actually, we now want a predatory interest rate on that. 500% interest on something we gave to you.
Right.
Other people gave to you, by the way. A different administration gave to you, by the way. And we want that. We'll have that money now, please.
What was the reaction from Ukrainians to this sudden deal that was proffered?
Well, when Trump was elected, there was a sort of, I guess this is becoming a theme. There was a sort of hopeless optimism about whether the Ukrainians could deal with Trump in a more effective way than with the Biden administration. So there had been, over the course of the last few years, a lot of frustration, pent up anger towards the Biden administration from the Zelensky administration.
Is that because of delays in slowly putting out weapon systems and delaying them and waiting to make sure the Russians were kind of not going to start World War III?
Right.
By us being nervous Nellies.
Yes, that's right. That over the first few years of the war, there was a lot of frustration with the Biden administration over denying weapons systems that they needed, the delay of things like permission to receive F-16s and HIMARS and ATACMS weapon
And
systems,
tanks, right?
everything. The
Hmm.
permission to even strike inside Russian territory where they were organizing in the open, and the Ukrainians weren't given permission to attack them. So, there was a lot of pent up frustration over the Biden administration, and there was this line of thinking in Kyiv that okay, the Biden administration, for whatever their support of Ukraine, that situation was leading not in a trajectory towards victory, but towards stalemate. Maybe the Trump administration could inject some productive chaos into the war. That has turned out to be,
Well, it's been
again,
chaos.
hopeless.
Yeah.
It's been chaos. It hasn't been
Yeah.
productive for the Ukrainians. I
No.
mean, I'm in Taiwan right now. There's a similar kind of line of thinking here, which is we can deal with a transactional president. In fact, a transactional president may even be better for our interests in the sense that if we provide something and get something in return, it solidifies an agreement that otherwise wouldn't be the case, right? So in Taiwan, the Taiwanese would be only too happy to pay because right now the situation is of strategic ambiguity, right? The United States has not been very clear about whether it would step in to protect Taiwan if there was a Chinese attack. The Taiwanese say to themselves, okay, well, if we give up something, if we have a contract, if we have something binding, that's a better situation than we have now. And so the Ukrainians have a similar concept, which is okay, maybe we can give up some of our critical minerals in return for security guarantees or long-term protection.
So bring them in, bring them into a thing, into an agreement that they can. But do you trust the Trump people at all? Because it doesn't seem to me that the Trump team is saying, you're going to give us a certain percentage of these minerals and gas and oil, but that doesn't mean we're going to back you up.
Right. That right now, none of the agreements or the draft agreements or the negotiations have involved security guarantees, right? Which is what Ukraine ultimately needs. But what the way that Trump has been, if you want to even call it negotiating, is that he's been using historical bonds of affection and alliances and friendships as if they were currency, as if they were leverage, right? That's not how you treat friends and partners and neighbors. But all around the world, Trump has been taking these relationships, which have been built many times on shared sacrifices and even blood during wars, and exploiting these relationships for extracting either personal or national resources and concessions, only to turn around after there have been some concessions to demand more. It's an evil way to think about friendship and partnerships, I think.
So the evil is on the part of Donald Trump, you would say? You're not going to get an argument from me, by the way.
It's an evil way to look at relationships that others have built over decades of time and use that to draw and extract and pull from people who are A, vulnerable, and B, dependent on your friendship. If you were in any other kind of normal civil situation, civilian situation, where you saw someone acting like this to their family friends or people they grew up with, you would do everything you could to disassociate yourself from that individual. And I think that's what's happening all around the world with Europe, Canada, even Asia, rethinking, can we rely on the United States at all? It's just been a few weeks of the Trump administration, but it's been incredibly, incredibly damaging to America's status in the world.
How surprised were the folks in Ukraine about this move where he basically did a 180 and that Trump has suddenly changed sides? and even saying that Ukraine started the war. And how shocking is this?
It was more shocking than it should have been.
In hindsight, yeah, I suppose, but boy, oh boy.
Trump is, for all of his many, many deficiencies, a very transparent person in terms of his emotions and his actions. And there is this long-standing trend of people thinking, well, maybe it won't be so bad, or maybe he won't do what he says, or maybe he doesn't mean it. And I think he absolutely does. And if you act as if he means what he says, because he's eventually going to get around to it if he has the attention span, you'll be a lot less surprised. This optimism about Trump not being as destructive as he says he wants to be is really poorly placed. And the Ukrainians fell into that trap. I know a lot of Americans in the time between the election and the inauguration fell into that trap as well. But it's going to be that bad and worse. It's time now to be prepared and to organize and to act as if he's going to do everything he intends to do.
Now, what does that mean? He's going to do everything he says he's going to do. Is he?
Well, when he says that the press is an enemy of the people, that's what he means. And you've seen just over the course of the last week how he intends to marginalize the press and to turn the White House press corps into a sort of glorified propaganda team.
They're for the first time in I don't know how long, in 50 years or so, that they aren't going to have a press corps that is chosen to represent all the press in, like, when they have small meetings. And now they're going to, it looks like they're going to be just having right-wing groups.
They're trying to handpick who gets to cover the president, as opposed to having a broad cross section of the most accessed media organization. But that's just one element of all of it. I think we're in for a period of turmoil in which this is just the very, very beginning, and no presidency is without its crises. And we know how Trump is going to act when a crisis hits. He's going to use that crisis as an opportunity to consolidate power. He's going to try to marginalize his perceived enemies, and he's going to weaponize the agencies of the state in order to crush his perceived opposition. It's our responsibility to make sure he doesn't get away with that.
Can I ask you where in Kyiv you live when you're there?
Yeah, well, I'll try not to get too specific, Al.
Okay, all right. Do you live in one of those buildings? I heard you say you're on the 10th floor. Is that right?
Yeah, I live on the 11th floor.
Oh, 11th floor. Sorry.
Of an apartment building near the government quarter in the very center of Kyiv.
I know exactly where you are now.
Living in Kyiv is a bizarre experience because 20% of the time, it's like any major urban cosmopolitan place. You can go get a cup of coffee or get a meal, but there's always this sense of, when's the next attack going to come, and they come pretty regularly.
And do you get air raid sirens?
You get an actual kind of like haunting dystopian 20th century air raid siren go off at all hours of the day and night. So
can you do it? Can you make the sound?
I can't personally make the sound, but it's
sorry
like,
to put you in that.
But it's like it's that classic World War II air raid siren, or even the sort of tornado warnings that sometimes happen in the United States.
Oh,
yeah, exactly,
like that.
Yeah, and it is.
Okay, I was guessing.
It's more haunting than that, Al.
Okay, so let me ask you something. When you hear that,
yeah,
do you go downstairs? Do you leave, or you go like, it's not gonna? The chances of it hitting me are so small that I'm just not going to go all 11 flights, and then worse, go up 11 flights, because I hear your elevators sometimes don't work.
My elevator doesn't work, particularly when there's no power. So it's been good for my aerobic capabilities, but
Right.
maybe not so great. So I mean, there are air raid sirens, and then there are air raid sirens, right? In Ukraine, there's actually been a pretty good system for warning people, in which they not only warn people, but if you go on social media, you can figure out. They put out the kinds of things that are being launched at Ukraine.
Uh-huh. I
And
see.
so, on smaller air raids, most people don't react. But then there are
Hmm.
days when, Russia is launching gigantic missiles at the city, or hundreds of kamikaze drones. And so there are days where you could make an assessment, okay, this is just a warning that something might be launched. And then there are days where you look at your phone and you think, okay, I've looked at this information, something very serious is happening, I probably should go underground.
And is that in the subway, or or where are those underground?
So underneath my apartment building, there's a parking garage. So that's occasionally a place I'll go. But when things get very serious, the subway, which is deep, deep underground, is the place where most people will congregate
I
and
see.
and kind of wait it out.
Now, do people have PTSD in Kyiv?
Absolutely. I mean, it depends how you define PTSD. And what I would say is that it's the result of chronic exposure to ongoing stress. So when I hear an air raid siren, I won't freak out or start running around or or panic. But I do, you do kind of. There is a physical reaction. Your blood pressure will rise, your heart rate will go up a little bit. Maybe not even super perceivably. You might tense up, but that happens 6 times a day. That'll happen 20 plus times a week, and over 3 years, people react, and I react to all sorts of loud noises that sound like it could be the beginning of that air raid siren that we talked about. So things like cars accelerating have that sort of similar tone
Hmm.
of increasing volume that it doesn't it's obviously not an air raid siren, but your body is and your mind is prepared to react as if it is. So when we're talking about do people have PTSD, I can't speak to everyone, but I could certainly say that people have been terribly traumatized over several years of being on edge, and that cumulative chronic
That
stress
sounds
that
like what I was asking. Yeah.
yeah, that's just talking about the civilian experience, not talking about the hundreds of thousands of people who have now fought on the front lines, the injured veterans, the people who have sacrificed the most
Hmm.
for the country during this period of war, who have seen far worse than chronic stress. They've seen repeated acute stress and seen things that no human ought to experience.
After Trump said, okay, that Ukraine attacked Russia and that Zelensky is a dictator, what was the effect on the folks in Kyiv and in Ukraine?
We have a story out on this at the Counteroffensive right now, my publication. The thing is that over the last few years, Ukrainian sentiment towards Zelensky has kind of steadily begun to deteriorate. This is natural as it relates to politicians.
Sure. But still, where is he? Where is he now in terms of approval rating in Ukraine?
He's in the let's just say around the mid 60s.
Okay, that's pretty.
That's pretty good by American standards. That's
Well,
very good,
yes,
pretty good by American
that's
standards.
shocking.
But but this is down from the 90s
Of course,
in the first weeks of the war.
of course. Didn't Trump say it was 4%?
Yeah, I was nowhere near 4%. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
the 2 out of every 3 Ukrainians still think he's doing a good job.
yeah.
But what Trump's attack on Zelensky did probably gave him another 20% of approval rating, in the sense that, Ukrainians will be the first to criticize their president, but it's kind of like family, only they will do it.
Hmm.
Other people outside don't have that right. And so we have the story about the nicknames for Zelensky in Ukrainian politics on our site. And there is a sort of a nickname that critics of Zelensky have been using for him over the last few years. And it's kind of wordplay to combine the word Zelensky with the Ukrainian word for dickhead, and it is Zalupa. And they've been calling him Zalupa.
Okay. But this is an affectionate dickhead. Is that right?
Well,
We love our Zalupa.
Well, that's what they were talking. That's what they were calling him before the Trump attack, and then after the Trump attack, they started calling him Sanich, which is kind of our guy.
Okay, I see.
They switch it up based on whether they're for him or against him, but they've got these series of nicknames that they call
Whether he
him.
has a foil, if he has Trump's foil now, he's on the good side.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that Trump's attack has rallied Ukrainian society around Zelensky. Who are you to say he's a dictator? He's our leader. We've chosen him.
Basically, you're saying that Trump saying this bullshit that this war was started by Ukraine and Zelensky's a traitor, all of that has raised their spirits. They've rallied around.
They're angry about this totally untrue criticism of their president. Only they have the right to criticize their president, not some guy from the United States, and certainly not some guy who has no idea, about anything related to Ukrainian politics. Firstly, I'd point out that, the kind of online discourse we've been discussing, calling the president a dickhead or whatever, is only possible in a free society. It's the kind of satire, Al, as you know, that is the hallmark of free speech.
Free society, yeah.
Exactly. Being able to call your president a dickhead is something you could never do.
In Russia, for example, you don't probably hear a lot of affectionate calling him a dickhead,
and
Putin.
Thousands of people have been prosecuted for comments online in Russia criticizing Vladimir Putin. So that in and of itself is an indication of how untrue this dictator slander is when it comes to Ukraine. But the point that you made there about people rallying domestically against foreign criticism, I mean, Trump has this effect all around the world. His comments to Canadians have revitalized the Liberal Party of Canada, which had been looking set for a terrible electoral defeat later this year to the Canadian Conservatives. His and J.D. Vance's support and Elon Musk's support of AFD led them, it seems, to a poor showing. This is the far right party in Germany.
Right, sure.
Poor showing in the recent German.
I thought they came in second.
They did come in second, but they came in below expectations. And aren't going to be included in any kind of government.
Oh, okay, good.
Going forward, even though they did come in second. Trump has this effect around the world. He's kind of forced other people to rally domestically and against the United States, which may be good in a lot of these countries for certain players, but certainly bad for the United States' standing in the world.
What will this summit between Zelensky and Trump, what will that be about this week? He's coming in on Friday, and we're taping this, I should say, on it's Thursday where you are, right?
That's right.
Thursday morning, and here it's Wednesday night.
Look, I think the Ukrainians realize, as does anyone with a pulse, really, that Trump isn't interested in a good deal. He's just interested in some deal, which he can then go around and say was the greatest deal of all time. So when the Ukrainians arrive, they're going to give Trump a deal, something to work with. From what we can tell, there isn't a lot of substance to the deal. It's just a deal to continue negotiations about future deals.
But this is about the minerals.
This is about critical minerals. They have, according to both sides, they have reached some agreement on critical minerals. But it is really a deal to continue talking about future deals. That there's a conceptual agreement that hasn't been ironed out and will need to be ironed out in the future. Now, Ukraine hasn't really gotten anything for this, but it's also not in substance giving up anything in the near term. So what they're going to be talking about in Washington, D.C., and what the Zelensky administration is going to want is to find some agreement which gives Ukraine long-term security guarantees. And the question you asked earlier, which is, can you depend on the United States? Or in particular, can you depend on Trump? Is a really valid one. Trump has gone around making deals in his first term, which he has promptly ripped up arbitrarily in his second. You think about the free trade agreement he made with Canada, which he, upon entering office,
And
immediately
Mexico.
ripped up and started threatening, and threatening both Canada and Mexico with new tariffs, new taxes. That's evidence point number one as to how he views the deals he himself negotiates. And so there is a big question. There should be a big question among American allies about whether you can trust the word of this man.
Well, he seems to change where he is, and I just thought that the negotiations and what's come out of Trump's mouth has been shocking. You know, clearly Russia was the aggressor. There's no question. Even Defense Secretary Hegseth said today that he didn't know who attacked whom, which is absolutely amazing. And it is frightening that such transparent lies are what they feel like they can get away with.
Well, I was in Kyiv the day the invasion started, like I said, and I know exactly who attacked who. The Russians obviously attacked Ukraine.
Okay, well, we'll take
But
it from you
it's
then.
not as if Hegseth knows,
Of course.
who attacked who. He just can't say it because Trump refuses to acknowledge it. And the entire administration is falling over backwards not to in any way contradict the person at the top, even if they know it's a lie. This is the start of a trend that is deeply, deeply worrying. These are the sorts of things you only see in democracies that are failing or authoritarian governments.
Right. This is 1984 kind of stuff.
Yes, you have to deny the truth that's before your very eyes, which you've personally witnessed and you personally know to be true. You must deny it, and that's kind of what we're seeing here, right? That's exactly what we're seeing here. Is everyone knows what the truth is, can't say it because you might hurt the president's feelings, and that's crazy.
So, what do Ukrainians think is going to happen in terms of the U.S. backing Ukraine? I mean, I wouldn't have any expectations of the United States if I were Ukraine right now.
Well, you ask 100 Ukrainians, you'll get 100 different answers. They're a very opinionated group of folks.
What are they most afraid of?
I think they're most afraid that their sacrifices that they made for years will be in vain. I think they're most afraid of the people who have died for Ukraine's sovereignty, having died, and there being a resolution that removes Ukraine's sovereignty anyways. I think that's the greatest fear. The greatest fear is not to continue to sacrifice, nor is it even for many Ukrainians to die for their cause. I think there are a lot of people willing and showing, by the way, their willingness to die for a cause. I think their fear is that it will ultimately have been for nothing. That if the resolution to the war leads to Ukraine not being an independent country or an independent country in name only, all of the things that have happened, millions of refugees fleeing the country, the thousands of people who have died, the many thousands more who have been wounded without limbs, with their minds torn, that will have been a gigantic sacrifice only to yield a worse situation than before the full-scale invasion.
And where are Ukrainians in terms of thinking how pessimistic are they? Have the people of Ukraine said, I see what Trump is doing, and I am despairing for what is going to happen? I know you say that all 100 Ukrainians have 100 different outlooks.
If we can generalize, the Ukrainians are not known for a, sunny disposition in general. We had a story on the counteroffensive recently about the so-called resting Slavic face that, Ukrainians don't smile a lot. Ukrainians don't smile a lot. So we did a story recently about why it is that they don't smile very much, even pre-war. So it's a cultural thing. They kind of view smiling as a sort of suspicious and inauthentic thing. It's expressed, especially when expressed towards people they don't know well. And so they've been very realistic and very kind of neutral about their expectations for the future. They've kind of just grit their teeth and gotten to work about what needs to happen next. I think there's a real expectation among most of the people I'm talking to in Ukraine that the war is going to go on for quite a deal longer. That the Trump-Putin negotiations aren't going to yield a sustainable and just peace, and what that's going to mean is more fighting.
Well, and not yielding a lasting and just peace. What are other outcomes that are short of that? Is it going to be okay? The U.S. will not back Ukraine, but the Europeans will. So the Europeans will come to. What percentage of the weaponry are the Europeans supplying now, as compared to earlier in the war?
The majority of the weaponry and funds since the beginning of the war have come from Europe, not from the United
Mm-hmm.
States. So it's about a 60-40 split. That said, you can't lose 40% of a particular contribution and proceed like, if you're running a business and you lose 40% of net revenues overnight,
Right.
that's a catastrophe, right? I don't think that there's any way for Ukraine to continue its level of effective resistance against the Russians without Europe massively. It would need to
Stepping up.
increase. Yeah, it would need to dramatically increase its contribution. And frankly, Europe doesn't have the capacity. It's been caught over the last few years very flat-footed. Its defense industry is poorly developed as compared to the United States. It doesn't have the manufacturing capability to churn out the kinds of arms that are needed on the front lines, things like artillery shells and mass numbers of drones, armored vehicles, tanks, things like that that are necessary to fight a war. The United States has a broad and effective and efficient defense productive capability that the Europeans currently lack, but are now scrambling to try to fix and build up. So that's a real issue, that the Europeans may have the will, but they don't have the productive capabilities to provide the weaponry necessary. In that way, the United States is still indispensable to Ukraine, and that's why you're seeing Zelensky go to the White House on Friday. He needs the United States on his side.
And can their relationship be, and I do not say repaired, but can it be put into such a state that Trump will at least give Ukraine a chance?
At a certain point, I wouldn't even consider it a relationship. I would consider it. I mean, do you have a relationship with the barista you purchase coffee from? It's a transaction, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not a friendship. It's not an alliance. Not even a partnership. It's a exchange. And with Trump, very often it's an extraction. It's a pillaging of a people who are desperate, who are literally dying by the day and need help. I wouldn't even call it a relationship. I would call it blackmail and extortion of someone who is trying their best to maintain their country's existence, very existence, and then taking advantage of that. Trump is taking advantage of that to extract things to boost, frankly, his ego, because the deal itself doesn't have any substance to it for the time being.
Is there any danger of a Trump has said, I could end this in one day. And is there any danger in Trump putting some kind of deal together where there is a, quote, peace, and it's really just Russia buying time?
It's not only that there is some danger to that, but that is the danger. Is the capital letters THE danger. I mean, the big fear has always been that Trump would create a so-called peace that was super advantageous for the Russians so that they could rearm and invade again. That looks to be where we're headed at this moment. It looks like the Trump administration will cut out the Ukrainians, negotiate some separate agreement with the Russians, say they solved everything, give the Russians every advantage in returning to the battlefield at some future point of their choosing, and leave the Ukrainians as weak and vulnerable as possible. That seems to be right now the way that things are headed. And it will only lead to more suffering, more war, more death in the long term. And by the way, I think the Ukrainians understand that too. They're not willing to delay to tomorrow the fight that needs to happen today. So you're going to find Ukraine to be quite skeptical of such an agreement. And by the way, the war doesn't end just because Trump says so. The war will end when there's some sort of sustainable and just agreement. And that doesn't even we're not even talking about that now, right? It's not even on the table at the moment. And that's why I feel like the end of the war is not in sight.
Not in sight.
I don't see us closing in on some agreement that would end this war. I could be wrong, of course. I've been known to be wrong, but I just don't see that. I don't see that this war will likely end, or hostilities will end until authoritarianism collapses in Russia.
Wow.
That's really the only way for Putin or whoever his successor is, and their and Russia's imperial ambitions to be removed from the table is for authoritarianism itself, which demands expansion and a sort of foreign enemy. That's the only way to end this situation.
But Trump has said that he was going to do it in one day, right?
We're still waiting for that, Al.
I understand that. But this is something he's sort of invested in. And so what I worry about is something that seems like a very short period, and then it's Russia regrouping. And that sounds like what you're expecting.
Vladimir Putin will not suddenly, at whatever resolution is involved, will not suddenly think to himself, okay, well, that was a good shot. I guess we'll move on to other things.
Yeah.
Dictators are used to getting what they want. Okay. And this will be a thorn in his side until the day he dies, is that he wasn't able to do this. By the way, it will be this kind of reminder for any subsequent leader, whoever comes after Putin. And there will be a day for them to try to achieve what Putin never could, which is to capture Kyiv or to bring the Ukrainians into their sphere of influence. This is something that is a generational challenge, and Ukrainians realize that. The thing is that the Trump administration just wants to kind of sweep it under the rug and ignore it and pretend that it's solved. But there is no genuine effort to resolve this war.
Okay, well, Zelensky is going to be there in a day and a half, I guess. What do you predict happens in that day?
From the Zelensky administration's point of view, what they need to accomplish is to secure some sort of guarantee of security that cannot be easily reversed. Whether that's European peacekeepers with an American backstop or NATO membership or something like that, where they have guarantees that they will not be invaded again. And if they don't have that, then any supposed peace is just a temporary solution.
So the best thing that can happen right now is some kind of stasis where there's a peacekeeping force. What would that be? A European force or be?
Yeah, so European countries like the UK and France have indicated that they'd be willing to send troops in a peacekeeping force. But I'm not sure that that's sufficient for the Ukrainians to feel secure. One thing that's not often discussed is we presume that Zelensky is a dictator, can just do whatever he wants. He can't. He has domestic political pressures just like any other democratic politician.
Mm-hmm.
If he signs a deal that doesn't make Ukrainians feel secure, they will protest him. They will vote him out of office. And there are certainly a lot of angry people in Ukraine who would be against giving up the fight.
Well, he has said that he would give up the presidency
if he got security guarantees and
Right.
an end to the war. It's a sort of performative thing. But that's not on the table right now, at least as far as I understand.
Mm-hmm.
It was one of those comments that make him look quite good, but really costs him nothing. That said, Zelensky needs to get something substantial in which Ukrainians can be confident in if he's going to sign a deal. He needs to be able to go to his own domestic population and say, these sacrifices that you've made over the last few years have been worth it because I have been able to secure this deal that ensures our continued survival and peace in the long term. And if he can't go to his people and say that, then he's going to have a lot of domestic problems.
If he can't go to his people and say that.
That's right. If he cannot go to his people and assure them that they will be safe in the long term, that their families can come back from abroad, that business can invest and the economy can start to recover, then what was it all for? What was all this suffering and death and panic and chaos for? Was it just to end up in a situation where they'll get attacked again in a matter of years? By the way, I mean that situation prohibits Ukrainian recovery, right? And no businesses will invest in Ukraine if they think another war might be just around the corner. It will keep Ukraine stifled and held back for years and years to come.
And do you see any hope of a different outcome?
There's always hope. I think our conversation has been about hopeless optimism, but there are some reasons for optimism, to include the Russian economy's overheating and the real problems in inflation.
They are having really big problems with their economy right now, like 20%.
They've spent 3 years pouring money into a system that has yielded dead people. And
how many Russians have died, do they think? I hear something like 800,000. Is that possible?
I think that may be the total casualty figures to include wounded and killed.
Mm-hmm.
But more Russians have died in the last 3 years than were killed over a decade of war in the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. That, if you'll recall, was one of the major contributing factors to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so this war may yet be won, but not on the battlefield. There are going to be enormous pressures in Russian civil society and on the domestic front as this inflation hits, as bread and butter get more expensive, and as the country fully comes to grips with how many people have died and been injured as a result of this totally senseless and pointless war.
Well, I hope that leads to something that can be a hopeful outcome, and I hope that happens soon.
I'm with you on that.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming to us today from Taipei. And when do you go back to Ukraine?
I'm headed back there this weekend, so I'll be there early next week.
Well, safe travels, and thank you very much for sharing your wisdom on this war.
Thanks, Al. I really appreciate being on your show.
Well, I hope you enjoyed listening. That beautiful music is by Leo Kottke, the great Leo Kottke. I want to thank Peter Ogburn for producing this podcast. We'll talk again next week.